Welcome to the Art of Life podcast. Very special episode today. I have our first ever guest on. So, Gray has been a friend of mine, and we have very, very similar life paths. We were just chatting before this podcast about how weird, like freaky weird it is, how in parallel our lives went. And we didn't meet till about 2017. So, welcome, Gray. Thanks
Thank
for.
you, thank you.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your story and what your mission is?
Well, sure. I guess in 2005, I was diagnosed with a very rare autoimmune disease, something called primary sclerosing cholangitis. It's a progressive disease that doesn't have any cure, doesn't really have any treatments. And generally, what happens is over time, the liver will start to fail. And in 2005, I required a life-saving liver transplant. So that is kind of the big before and after in my life is this liver transplant in 2015. However, there was a bit of a spur in 2005 when I was first diagnosed with PSC to live a big life. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know how this was all going to play out, so I decided at that point that I was going to do some things that I always wanted to do, and we can get into that a little bit later. But at this point, after my transplant, I guess the focus of my life right now is giving back to the cause that saved mine, and that's organ donation. So I am a transplant athlete. I represent Canada internationally when I swim. Like a normal athlete as well, meaning I compete against regular individuals, not just transplant recipients. Bit of a martial artist and as well. Spent many years in the Muay Thai uh, um, ring and that lifestyle. And I guess what I'm trying to do right now is be the influence that I didn't see when I was laying in the ICU bed after my transplant. I didn't see anybody living a big life after transplantation. I didn't know what was possible. So through my work as a transplant athlete, through my not-for-profit, the Move for Life Foundation, I'm all about giving back to that cause that saved mine. Hopefully, inspiring some people to live big after transplantation as well.
That it's so cool, and very similar and on brand to what me. What's crazy about me and Gray is I had heard of him because I've had two liver transplants now for the same rare liver disease, PSC, and because I was working with the Gift of Life Foundation stuff, I had heard that there was this guy that did Muay Thai too, who had a transplant for PSC, and I was like, what a world! And we finally met when we did that steel mace certification through On It.
Yeah, I remember doing that steel mace certification. That was a super fun day. I really enjoyed that. Learned some stuff. I remember you and I playing around, just doing some touch sparring afterwards.
Yeah,
I won't forget that because that was the first time I moved with you, and I was like, "Oh yeah, this guy's legit too." I liked it.
yeah. I just think it's cool. People need more of us.
Hmm.
Like like as you know, when I was ill, like I didn't know what to expect. But as you kind of touched on earlier, for me it was like I don't know what's next, but I know I have a lot of life left to live. And I don't know about you, but personally, I look at my illness and my transplants now as a very positive thing.
Hmm.
I would not be the man I am today. I would not have taken the risks or sought out the experiences I have without it.
Yeah, that's such a funny thing to live with. This super traumatic experience where, quite honestly, like I was hours away from dying. So I don't know if you know this, Matt. I'm sure you do know this part. Regularly, when someone's on the transplant list, they're waiting about 6 months before they get a liver. Um, and my story was a little bit different. I was fully functioning quite well until I wasn't. I had this dramatic drop, and I was so sick that they initially came around, the transplantation team came around and told me I was too sick for the surgery. They actually denied me. They said they wouldn't put me on the list. And then they came back a week later to reassess. I guess I was dealing with a blood infection, and they couldn't operate on me when I was having a blood infection. So they came back a week after and they told me that, okay, the blood infection is done. You can be on the list. and I shot to the top of the list. They came into my room at Toronto Western Hospital at the time at 11 a.m. They came to tell me I was on the list. Oh, that they would put me on the list. Then they came back at 3 o'clock, told me that they had a liver for me, and that at 6 o'clock that same day, I was moved to Toronto General, and I was in surgery at 5 in the morning the very next morning. So I was told, actually, I guess it was my family that was told because I wasn't very coherent at that time. My family was told that that was my time. Like, if I didn't get that liver, I'm sure this conversation wouldn't have happened. I'm sure we wouldn't have had that steel mace certification experience in 2017. I wouldn't be here. My daughter would have lost her father when she was 2. So it's what a ride. And here's the thing, I echo exactly what you're saying. I wouldn't choose this whatsoever. But at this point, I wouldn't change it. I look at the things that I'm up to. I look at the things that I am doing around the world and traveling and competing and representing Canada and transplant athletes around the world and the work that my not-for-profit is doing. How could I change where my life is now? I absolutely love it. My perspective is so different. I like to say that my transplant gave me new eyes, and those are the eyes that I now see the world through.
I really like that saying. I think it puts a feeling that I didn't have words for before. You have new eyes. You have
Oh,
new perspective, right? I didn't know all that.
hmm.
If correct me if I'm wrong, you had a gym in the Cayman Islands, which you closed because of your health, correct?
Yeah, so that's where I was running my Muay Thai gym. So it was like in partnership with Southside, because Mikey Perez and Bruce Ong, they came down and did a couple of seminars with me and my students. But yeah, I had set up my Muay Thai gym when I was living in the Cayman Islands, and I left because well, the writing was on the wall. Like I was feeling good. I was feeling good, but then I got a bout of what like that cholangitis infection in my liver, and it was very painful. And I realized that, OHIP is a is a really good thing. So I figured I needed to move back, need to be close to family, need to be close to home, because there's no transportation option in the Cayman Islands. Anyone that's in Cayman, they have to go to the States, and it's a whole thing.
Wow.
So yeah, I had to close the gym at that point, but super cool to watch some of my students directly after and continuing to this day to be teaching themselves now and creating a community or keeping a community that was together. Really, really cool. Last year, I went back to the Cayman Islands with 10 years after I left, and there were still, I don't know, my friend Jesse threw me a bit of a like a welcome home, if you will, party. And he invited a bunch of my old students there. And so 10 years later, there was a bunch of my students that came out and saw me. And uh, talk about like touching experiences, like to have these people that I haven't seen for 10 years. Yeah, we've been in contact, but for them to take time out of their lives to come and see me just because I'm on the island, that felt phenomenal. And that's what's to me really, really cool. And I'm sure you know this too. That's what's cool about that, the Muay Thai and really the fighting community, is you build these bonds with people that I don't think you build. It's hard to build outside of that type of environment. I like to say often that some of the closest people in my life have punched me in the face, and and I like that. It's cool. I'm sure that's your experience too with the bonds that you make over literally blood, sweat, and sometimes tears.
Yeah, even like when I went to the Caymans, I messaged you, and one of your
Yeah.
students brought me. We trained together, we sparred. Um, I talk about like my travel hack is to go to any martial arts gym because even if we don't speak the same language,
Mm.
we speak the same movement.
Hmm.
And one of the best ways for me to travel and make friends, um, I think it's so cool. And they say teachers affect eternity.
Mm.
And I'm actually working on a speech right now for the Canadian Liver Foundation. And
Nice.
yeah, which I'm super stoked about. But I was reflecting, I'm like, for me to be alive, it's not just a donor. Like I've had a deceased donor in my father, but it's also all the research. It's
Mm.
also all the surgeons. It's also all the nurses. Like it's these thousands of lives that gave a little bit of their time, their energy, their attention that kept me alive. And thus I've been able to have, almost over 1,000 students. I have one of my students that just opened a gym in India. And it's just crazy to see the impact we have without knowing.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and especially when it comes to passing knowledge. Like I'm nothing special. All I did was pass the knowledge in Muay Thai that was given to me by my teachers, and I put my little personal spin on it, and just gave the same lessons. And that's really cool that like you've got students that are doing that, opening their own gym in India. Like that's phenomenal. And it's the same thing. Like, yeah, you going and seeing Floyd, my old student, and moving around with him because now he's high up in the boxing world there. It's super cool.
Yeah, unreal. What I do want to touch on today is the trauma of going through, of being told. So I have my own experiences, and like you said, in the community, I always believe diagnosis is a tool, not an excuse, but
Mm,
it's the ultimate trump card,
oh
right?
yeah.
I've had two liver transplants, like I can't do it, and no one's gonna argue with me,
No.
which is a blessing, but it can be easily abused because we seek comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And something I think we have in common is we used it as not an excuse, but as a reason why.
Mm-hmm.
But I do believe it is some sort of response to a very traumatic emotional experience where people who would go through that will make a choice. So I was just wondering, have you done any work with therapy, counseling? I know you did Vipassana, which I really want to talk about after this.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm just curious what insight you would have as far as how you dealt with that trauma to come out. So a lot of people don't come out the way we did.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. When I would go to clinic right after my transplant, I immediately noticed that in clinic, I would notice that the people that were there, the majority of them they looked small and fragile and weak. And even though I was that same person at that time, right after my transplant, there was an energy that didn't connect with there. I was like, these aren't my people. And then I found the Canadian transplant games and then the World Transplant Games. And so I recognize that there are people out there that have been through what you and I have been through, that have gone through that traumatic experience. And have decided to, hey, listen, I don't have to live small and fragile. This is my bonus life. I want to live this as big as possible. And those are my kind of people. Um, so when I was in the hospital immediately after my transplants, I was in the ICU for a number of days. I had to go on a ventilator for a few days right after my transplant. And when I came out of that, I remember feeling a lot of emotion. And I know the emotion was internal, but it was also influenced by the concoction of drugs that I was on, the pain medication, and all of that stuff. So my thoughts were my own, but also influenced by what the substances that were in my body. But I remember feeling almost like a little bit of survivor's guilt, thinking to myself that, hey, I'm happy to be alive, but knowing that there was someone that died for me to be alive. See, my donor was deceased. I know that you had your father, which is incredible. I love that.
Hmm.
And then you've had a deceased donor as well. So you would understand the deceased aspect of it. For me, I felt like, oh man, like this person had to die. It's almost a responsibility for me to live big. And any time that I'm feeling that I maybe want to slow down or maybe this is a little bit too much, I think of my donor who is in me, who's a part of me right now. And if not for me, for him is how I keep moving. And it's funny you talked about the trump card. I use that saying the trump card myself. I remember I I started doing this is maybe 3 years ago. I did a 5 kilometer open water swim race. And halfway through the first, it was a 1 kilometer loop, so you had to go around 5 times. So halfway through the first loop, I was like, why am I doing this? I'm tired already. I don't want to do this. I'm tired. I started like panic breathing a little bit, even though I'm a good swimmer. It's not like I was scared to be in there. It was the task of knowing I was going to be continuously swimming for the next hour and 20 minutes. Um, and I remember saying to myself, I can get out. I can say I'm a transplant recipient. Nobody's going to say a thing to me whatsoever. But that seems like an excuse, and it seems like something that can be overplayed or overused. And sometimes I do have to use it. Sometimes I know that I really do need to take a step back. I can't push myself. Like, the reality is I am a transplant recipient on immunosuppressing medication. So I'm not functioning like everybody else is. Um, but I don't like to use that card all that often, for sure. Now, you asked me a little bit about therapy. I did speak to a therapist that was attached to the General Toronto General Hospital, like the multi-organ transplant program. So I ran a few things by her, and we had some discussions. But to tell you the truth, Matt, I've been a bit of a seeker for many years. I've been like early 2000s, before I was even diagnosed with PSC. I was reading about meditation. I was reading about spirituality. I was reading about mind over matter, things like that, like trying to get different perspectives. And I did do some meditative retreats, maybe like 2 or 3 day retreats a couple of times. Um, and then I also read a lot about, and this is like for some people, maybe not for some people, but I read a lot about Stoicism, and that really applied well for me, I thought. Immediately after I had my transplant, I read the book The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. And that one really just framed the fact that I don't want to avoid this in my life. Really, the path forward is directly through it. And accepting that this is who I am, that I'm a transplant recipient, accepting that I want to live big despite these hurdles and these battles. So it's nothing secret, nothing special. A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, probably a little bit of column C, and then I get inspired by just people that I see around that are maybe not even transplant recipients. They're just doing things that I think are cool, that I want to emulate in my life. So I can learn from anybody. I like to pick and choose things that make sense for me, and I discard the things that don't make sense for me. So anyone is a teacher for me, absolutely. What
Uh,
about you? Have you done a lot of the therapy?
it's so interesting. So sometimes when listening to you talking, it's like I'm hearing myself talk. Um, even like the trump card thing, and something I've struggled with a lot is so you touched on this right at the beginning. You talked about you're living this life for the person that died so you could live,
Mm,
right? And I just listened to a podcast about toxic fuel versus positive fuel.
yeah.
Um, and one of the things that's been a theme in my life is a lot of shame.
Mm,
So I've driven myself through shame because I couldn't not show up to training,
mm.
right? If I had a fever, I couldn't not show up to training. And that mentality, up until this year, has put me in the hospital so many times. And trying
Yeah.
to reframe that has been really interesting. And I didn't notice till right now, but something me and you have in common that I think a lot of people who get ill in these transplants don't is we were on the path of seeking. We were in the warrior archetype before we
Mm,
got ill.
absolutely.
Um,
Yeah, it was a lot of, honestly, a lot of the training and the hours spent doing Muay Thai, that toughness. Like, hey, I remember when I was training, I would think to myself, there's no way that anything outside of this gym that I'm going to face today is harder than this. Like the when I'm sparring with somebody, even if I'm just skipping, if I'm doing the push-ups, if I'm doing pad work, it like nothing outside of this gym is going to be harder. So I used to walk out of Muay Thai before my transplant with that kind of confidence, able to walk through life knowing like, listen, I've already done some hard stuff today. Um, Nothing I'm going to come across on the street is going to challenge me in this. So it gives me this big chest a little bit, not a conceited chest, but like a bigger chest, a proud chest, I guess. Oh geez, I think I forgot where I was going with that. That's so funny. But oh no, I remember exactly. So it was a lot of that mentality that I pulled on during my rehabilitation after my transplant. When I left the hospital, I left in a wheelchair because I had been in bed for about 3 months. All my muscles had atrophied. When I was in the ICU, I was being changed because I was wearing a diaper. I'll say that I was being fed. I couldn't feed myself. I didn't have the dexterity or the strength to get the spoon to my mouth, so people fed me. And so to be completely dependent, but knowing that you can rebuild yourself and knowing that you've gone through this hard training, it kind of provided this, as you said, this warrior archetype for me to draw on or draw from. And I think that definitely helped when I was rebuilding my body, when I was rebuilding my mind. And so, yeah, the more you do that type of seeking work, that internal seeking, that's only going to help you when you're faced with something, when you're coming up against something.
Yeah. Um, that's so I'm still sitting with that because I wonder how much more difficult it would be to start that path after versus having already been on it, right? You had that inertia. Exactly what you said. Like there was just a fire in me
Mm,
going through that transplant, and also there was like ignorance and naivete because I was like 16. You
I
know,
know.
at 16, like I didn't get like the reality of the world and what was happening in my head was so different.
Yeah,
And I remember being in ICU and Dr. Grant came and it's a teaching hospital at sick kids.
yeah,
And just like, I don't know how many, like 20 students learning. And they're like, this is Matt, 16 years old, transplanted for PSC. I was in ICU and he's like, Matt, do you have any questions? And I was like, when can I walk? Um, and I worked with him like a year later or so for the gift of life. He's like, I've never had a patient say that, never mind in sick kids. But that came from the martial arts training.
yeah. That's interesting. I have a similar story to that. When I was in the ICU, when I was off the ventilator, when I was starting to feel a little bit better, as you know, I wasn't moving all that much. So the rehabilitation individual would come into my room and they would strap a set of pedals to my legs, and it was like a bicycle, but I was laying down, and it moved my legs for me. It like I wasn't even moving the legs, but they moved for me, and then I would have to get up, and we would try to walk down the hall. And I remember telling the rehab therapist when they came into my room, maybe like the second time, I'm so happy you're here. I'm looking forward to this. Let's go. And he said to me, he's like, "Oh, I only have one other person that says this." And it was this retired military officer. And I was like, "Yeah, that makes sense."
Yeah.
Because most people, he walks into the room and they groan. And they're like, "Ugh, oh man." Me, I was up. I was like, "Okay, let's go. I know how far I walked yesterday. Let's beat that today." And it's that same mentality. Yeah, I don't know. It's
Yeah.
developed
Embracing the
over
work.
time. Yeah, I guess that's what it is.
Um, to touch back, you had asked about therapy, and I've
Mm,
done a lot of, as you have, right? We've done a lot of personal development, and I've done a lot of counseling and social work, and a lot of psychedelic work with
mm,
myself to better understand. Um, I think something that we have in common is like that curiosity, right?
yeah.
Like what fuels me. Like I remember talking to a counselor, and she's like, "Well, you're going through so much. Like, what keeps you going?" And I had to really sit and think about it. And for me, it was like curiosity. Like I just want to know what's going to happen next.
Mm,
And it's hope that like things are always going to get better. Like I have faith that things will get better. Hope, faith. Um, and it's like this hunger for experience. Like those three things, no matter how depressed I got, how sick
mm,
I was, those things really kept me going. And then doing like we'd both done Landmark, which is a personal professional development program.
mm,
Um, and then I found going to my own, like I never did a big ceremony with psychedelics, but I would utilize them as tools to better understand myself. That's something that really made me kind of see why I'm the way I am. I
mm,
think all humans, what's interesting about like psychology and social work is like all humans fall under some kind of spectrum, right? We make decisions based on a trauma and we go from there.
mhm.
Or we have a relationship with such parent and one of two things happens. And it's kind of like this maze where you can go whatever direction.
Hmm.
and I spent a lot of time trying to wonder, where did who I am, where did my values come from, and how did this transplant really affect me? How did being told, I was less serious than you, but they told me I had 6 months to live when I was 16.
Mm.
And then what was hardest for me, I think, along the whole journey was, okay, I'm going to go through this and everything's going to be okay, right?
Hmm.
I'm going to go through this awful pain. I'm going to get back on my feet. And then I went to China to train. And then to get sick so quickly and be told, this wasn't the case, but I was told that I had the quickest medically recorded reoccurrence of PSE and that they needed to transplant me again,
Yeah.
which is why I got transplanted. I kept having cholangitis, which is awful, like super high fevers, almost having seizures,
Yep.
and
Not fun.
yeah, awful. But when they took the liver out, they realized, hey, like I had a really bad episode of rejection 5 days out. And actually, when I was at Sick Kids, they're like, the record was like, I don't remember, 12 days or something for discharge. And I was like, I'm gonna beat it. I gotta beat this record. And they're like, Matt, you're gonna beat it. And then I had this crazy episode of rejection. Like, there's no way you're gonna beat it anymore. Um, but it's definitely shaped me to have this fear of missing out, which is something I
Mm.
need to overcome.
Okay.
There's times where like I have a fever, but like I don't want to miss this event. Life's so short, blah blah blah. And I think the awareness I've done through that curiosity has allowed me to just see my weaknesses better.
Mm.
I
Yeah, it's
don't
interesting. Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Sorry.
No, no, go ahead,
What
go
I,
ahead.
what I was going to say was it's interesting because I recognize those three things that you were drawing from the curiosity and such, and I have one more that really I felt drove me in not settling for a life as a transplant recipient, a small life, but driving to be big and take on these big challenges. And it was my daughter. So she was 2 at the time. And so she was a big motivator for me to even get through that period because she didn't come to my to the hospital to come and see me. I didn't want that image of me like that in her memory. But I would receive photos every single day from her mom, and that kind of kept me going. And now outside of the hospital and just living life now, she's still that motivating factor when I feel like, you know what, I don't want to go training today because maybe I'm feeling a little bit tired or I had a bad sleep last night and something like that. I think of her and I want her to see a living example of somebody that has overcome something and then has not just survived, but has chosen to thrive, that you really can influence with a little bit of hard work and determination what your life looks like. We all have that control. And sometimes you don't know what the path looks like. You don't know what the path forward looks like. But if you don't take that first step, you'll never get there. And that first step sometimes is really hard. It was hard for me sometimes. Like, I don't know where I'm going. The first step is always like unnerving, but you have to trust. Just trust that things are always working out for me. Um, Not in a conceited way, but just because like this, I've given myself over to whatever power is bigger than I, and I certainly believe that there's a power bigger than me, and I've given myself over to that, and just trusting that whatever I'm doing, one foot forward, one day at a time, little steps every single day. Um, what I've done over the last 9 years is, I think, is a great example for my daughter. So yeah, thanks for sharing your three. I just wanted to add that one because that one was
Yeah.
is personally big for me.
Yeah, I'm sure like your whole responsibility for this other person's life and survival
Yeah,
and thriving. I'm not a parent, so I can't relate, but I did
yeah.
see what my parents went through, seeing me ill and feeling helpless about it, and like what a parent's love is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you talked about faith a little bit,
Mm.
and I think faith gets a bad rap. Actually, I don't identify myself with any major religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a friend who's quite religious, and we were traveling together, and I was like, oh, like I renounced my attachment to faith. And he goes, Matt, you're one of the men I know with the most faith. He's like, you're not religious. And it was a clicking moment for me where I was like, oh, my faith, the dogma behind it, or not the dogma, the stigma is like I'm talking about religion, but faith is just belief that things are going to be okay.
Mm,
And there's this mindset of like the burnt toast analogy is what I used to explain it,
tell me.
has has ultimately made my life better. It's I think saved my life to not stress about things. So when you burn toast in the morning, if you're eating toast, it sets your day back 5 minutes.
Hmm.
And you can look at it and be like, man, now I'm 5 minutes late. I don't get to have my coffee, or I'm going to be late for work, or I'm going to hit traffic, or whatever. Or you can look at it as the universe or God, his way or their way of setting you back 5 minutes because you needed to be protected from a car accident, or you needed to meet someone and they weren't going to intersect with you unless you left 5 minutes from your house later.
Hmm.
And that mindset, and I look at that with my transplant, I look at that with everything, makes everything hard a little bit easier to digest.
That's so interesting. So that is a different way, and a different way of saying essentially that what I said earlier was that there's this trust in that everything is always working out for me. Is that I might not understand why or the battle that I'm in, the burnt toast. Why did I burn my toast? But I have to trust that this burnt toast or that this episode of whatever I'm going through is for a reason. And whatever that reason is going to be unknown to me. And I want to say, like, I think like a good definition of faith is belief in the things that like of things that are unknown. It's just believing in the unknown.
Mhm.
And how interesting. I've never heard that burnt toast thing.
Yeah.
It's a different way of looking at something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think like we have this in common. I see it in your lifestyle. Like you also believe in yourself. Like
Hmm.
whatever life will throw at you, you're gonna be able to handle it
Yeah.
because we've
It,
been tested, right?
Well, and that's the thing. And the more I callous my body and I callous my mind, the more I know I have this belief and that I can overcome. Like one thing that I overcome gives me the confidence to take on something bigger. And once I've accomplished that bigger thing or survived even if that's the win, because sometimes that is the win, just surviving. And once I've survived that, then yeah, interesting. Very cool.
Yeah, there's a quote by Alex Hormozy. He says, "Nobody
Hmm.
loves epic heroes without epic monsters."
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And any hero's story. I mean, what's better than a story than like when someone is going, they hit a roadblock and then they overcome whatever that is. Like that's the best story out there in my eyes.
Yeah, and there's an author, right? Like all movies, all books, all entertainment is based on the archetype of the hero,
The hero's journey.
right?
Yeah.
The hero's journey. Um, you had touched base, so I'm going to tell you a little bit. So you did Vipassana recently. So for those that
Mm,
don't know, Vipassana is a 10-day silent retreat, and I moved to Costa Rica during COVID because I just couldn't work. I couldn't work in Canada with all the lockdowns and stuff.
hmm.
And I had an opportunity. I had a little bit of money saved up because I was planning on opening a gym. I was like, I'm just gonna fuck off and go to Costa Rica. No plan. Moved into a hostel. Uh, Sparred at a gym. Got a job. Was working with one of the fighters there. He owned a touring company. Hired me as a tour guide. So I was just like doing jujitsu, teaching Muay Thai, surfing. The reason I left was just because I had some major health issues, and as you know, like we got to be somewhere with good healthcare for that.
Yeah.
But on that trek, and something I've been dealing with up until this year was like my ability to sit alone with nothing,
Mm.
right? Which is a little bit of a, I'm starting to learn like a trauma response to be able to sit, no book, no phone, nothing, and just be and like pay attention to the thoughts that are happening. I had met two men there that immediately, you know, when you meet someone, they're like, there's something about this person.
I do.
I met the first guy on the beach, white dude, dreadlocks, pretty fit, and we're chatting, and I'm like, there's something about him. And then he's talking to me, and he had been in prison for 17 years for growing weed
Hmm.
in California. And he was talking about how now there's people with those same lands growing weed that are paid by the government, where I
Yeah.
spent 17 years in prison for.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book in prison. And then he mentioned Vipassana. He's like, this was a life changing experience. And
Hmm.
at the time, I was like, that's terrifying. 10 days where you don't get to speak, you get one meal a day, you can't exercise, you can't read, you can't write. And there were still like some restrictions for COVID in Costa Rica, which were weird. It was like all businesses have to close at 11. And I
Hmm.
was at like a beach party and I was like, I want to eat. So I went to this pizza truck and there's a guy sitting there and we started chatting. And immediately I'm like, there's something about this dude. Um, and we got along great. We ended up going back to his place. We're playing video games and we're chatting about life. And he also mentioned Vipassana. This is like within a week of each other
Interesting.
about how it changed his life. And he talked to me about the things that he uncovered that were affecting him, like these traumas. And trauma is like a really hot word. It doesn't have to be a negative thing. It's something like a punch is not bad to me. You know, I get punched in the face all the time. It's just something that wakes you up.
Yep.
And how he had uncovered all this trauma that was affecting every aspect of his life through this 10-day silent meditation because your thoughts just go crazy. So I want to hear
Hmm.
about what your experience was like in that 10-day silent meditation. Maybe tell us what Vipassana was, like what it was like, walk us through it, and what you learned.
Yeah, well, like to start, calling it a retreat is is really misnaming what this experience is. But that is, it's a 10-day silent retreat. And so I went up in the middle of the country just outside of Barrie. Um, and there's a meditation center and there's a men's residence and there's a women's residence and we're split, we're segregated by sex, so we don't have any contact with the women, we only see the men, and we arrive the day before it starts. So you meet your roommate, you meet the people around, you can have conversations or you don't need to have conversations, it doesn't matter. And then that night begins the 10 days of silence. And and then the schedule for the following 10 days is an intense schedule where we were up at 4 in the morning. We were in bed with lights out by 9:30 at night. We were meditating 10 hours per day in a very particular technique. And oftentimes we are meditating in what's called a meditation cell, which is essentially it's a room, a very small room, big enough for them to put a cushion in or whatever you need to meditate on, so you can be comfortable while seated on the floor. And it's dark, and it's just it's maybe like 4 by 5 feet, and so you close the door, so you're isolated there as well. And so there is so much time in your own head. Even though you're trying to meditate, you're constantly being pulled back to your mind's wandering thoughts. Anyone that's meditated knows that this happens. And the idea of this Vipassana is to essentially observe all these little subtleties in your body. And the sharper that you can define, the sharper you can make your attention, the more focused you become on the subtleties that you feel on your body, within your body, around your body. And eventually, what you're trying to essentially do is rewrite your, and so you're to uh, notice these sensations. Could be pain, could be pleasure, could be discomfort, could be annoyance, could be glee. It could be any of these things. We're not to attach to those whatsoever. So as soon as you start feeling yourself leaning towards the positive or avoiding the negative, you've got to recenter yourself. So it's not just following the thoughts, it's following the physical feelings. And the idea behind this is that with time and with practice, you will change your brain's habitual patterns so that you're no longer avoiding pain. You're able to sit with it and observe it and not let it flood your mind and allow the mind to be like, oh man, how do I make it stop? How do I make it stop? At the same time, you're not seeking out the pleasurable stuff. And there was some incredibly pleasurable experiences while I was meditating. And it's hard to not follow that feeling of euphoria, which definitely comes. But once again, yeah, don't follow that. Remain neutral because it's the attachment to this craving and this aversion that ultimately leads to the suffering. So, what this Vipassana meditation retreat really was a way for you to practice changing your thought patterns, or at the very least, noticing your thoughts becoming patterns and hopefully interrupting those patterns, and then taking that outside of the meditation facility and applying that to real life. So if I come across somebody on the street that gives me a side or maybe pushes into my shoulder a little bit, and I'm like, what the fuck is that guy's problem? Like that's me, like kind of craving this annoyance feeling. And so being able to walk through the life where you're almost a bit less affected by the exterior because your interior has been strengthened. It quite honestly, Matt, was the hardest thing I've ever done. That amount of time. So I'll explain it this way. Day one, you're just your mind is open, your eyes are open, you're just figuring out what the day looks like. You're following the schedule. You're like, okay, fine. You get to the end of the day, you go to sleep because you're exhausted. Then you wake up the next day, you go through that day again. For me, this is how it played out. I went through the day again, and I was in the evening group meditation where there were 70 people in a room and we're meditating. And to have this many people in a room and hear nothing. The sound of silence was incredible. Like the energy flow in that room was really, really something. But on day two, for me, I was like, I don't have another 8 days in me. I wanted to leave. I was like, this is tough. What makes it even tougher is that it's by donation. So I didn't pay. So I could have left at any time. So it's not like I dropped $800 on this experience and I think to myself, well, I need to see this through to get my money's worth. It was the choice that made it so difficult because I could have left at any point. And in fact, I don't know about on the women's side because we were separated, but on the men's side, there were at least 5 people that left. They couldn't hack it, they couldn't do it. Day three came and I was better, bought some momentum. Day 4 and 5 were okay. Day six, I woke up 4 a.m. once again and I was exhausted. And now you start pulling these, look, I can pull out this transplant trump card. I'm not feeling well. I gotta leave, all this kind of stuff. But once again, that's when I'm drawing on the two sources of inspiration for me, which is number one is what is my donor? Did my donor die for me to leave this experience? No, no, he didn't. If I could have a conversation with him, he wouldn't say, after giving up his life and giving up his organs to me and probably, 7 other people, yeah, you should leave. Live small. So, number one. Number two, what will my daughter think of me? She knows I'm away. In fact, that was a hard part to be away from my daughter for those days. I love spending time with my daughter. And so I wasn't able to talk to her. I talk to my daughter every single day. And to go 10, actually 11 days without speaking to her was really, 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 really hard. So it was those two things. And then you get to the end and you've gone through all these experiences and they're also personal, and it's a whole other podcast to talk about like what the experiences were in that. But what I realized when we broke our silence and I started talking with other people was that there were a lot of people that were there that were dealing with a lot of anger in their lives. Like that was what they were coming up with or coming up against. And, my biggest takeaway from that experience was that, quite honestly, I don't have any really anger, which is it was something really to notice. I'd left that feeling a lot of gratitude for my life, a lot of gratitude for the ability to even do something like this. Because I'm sure there are people out there that would benefit from this type of experience, but they don't have the means to be able to do that. So even
Hmm.
gratitude for me to be able to suffer through these incredibly difficult 10 days. Um, it was a life-changing experience. Like anything that is hard and makes you question whether or not you want to continue, where you're genuinely feeling like you want to quit, and then you don't, you grow from. And so the growth that I came out of that with felt big, felt quantifiable. And of course, over time, away from the retreat, that lessens a little bit. You don't
Hmm.
feel it as intense, but that's where a bit of a daily practice comes into play. And it was funny when I went there, there were some what are called old students, which just means people that have done the course before. And I was talking to a guy who actually doesn't live far from me, and he was on his third 10-day course in about 4 years. And I thought to myself, like, during this, I'm like, how did you do this again? Like, how did you want to do this again? And then at the end of it, I realized that now I've walked away with the knowledge of something. I was taught something over these 10 days. The people that come back now take what they have taught and now they practice it. And so it was a whole different experience. And like their perspective is so different. Now they're leaving the world so they can practice this because they know what they're getting out of it. And so I already know that in a year's time I will do that again.
Wow. Whew. I got goosebumps while you're talking about this, and something you said is really interesting that I never would have thought of is our instinct, like it's an animal instinct to move away from pain and
Mm.
embrace euphoria.
Hmm.
And the goal of this practice is to move neither direction, stay neutral.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, what's interesting about Vipassana and what I really liked about Vipassana is there is no dogma. There
Yeah.
isn't a picture of anybody there. You don't meditate, you don't say a mantra or anything like that. You're not visualizing anybody or anything. It is a practice. It is an observable practice with no spiritual guru attached to it or anything like this, like with some crazy outfit and this long wavy hair and this beard down to here. Like that isn't a part of this. And that's what I liked about Vipassana specifically, is that it's so applicable to anybody, regardless of whether you're a devout Christian, a devout Muslim, a devout Buddhist. It does, like, you can do this. And in fact, this is in its purest form, the technique that hasn't been altered at all, that can be traced directly back to the practice of the Buddha himself. This is what the Buddha himself used to obtain his enlightenment. There are other practices that have spawned from Vipassana, but they've mixed in a little bit of cultural this, a little bit of religion that, or a little bit of guru this. So the pure form of it is harder to find, which was really appealing to me, the lack of dogma.
Wow. That's so cool. And to be able to trace it back that far. What would you say, and you might have touched on this a little bit. So you talked about it being a life-changing experience.
Mm.
So gray before, gray after. What's the biggest difference or subtle differences you would say?
It's not that I wasn't a kind person or an empathetic person before, but it is just, but it's enhanced now. And it's just more patience for people that I maybe had less patience for, and situations that I found less than favorable before, because I'm no longer trying to avoid the negative, or I'm not being swayed by the crave of something to finish or something that I desire. So if somebody cuts me off in traffic, sometimes you get frustrated, what the heck, what's up with this dude, give them the finger or something like that. Um, but them cutting me off in traffic has more to do with them than it does me, and it really has nothing to do with me. And so, why am I allowing the energy from that person or that experience to disrupt the the neutrality that I'm trying to keep? So I feel like it's given me the tools to be able to certainly not perfect that, but at least to catch myself in the moment when I'm starting. Much like when people just meditate, follow their breath, they catch themselves thinking about whatever they need to do on the weekend rather than following their breath if that's what they're doing, this Anapana type meditation. It's the same thing, but it's just taken into the world, I guess. So it's like an application, I guess, is the roundabout way of saying it.
Wow, that's now I'm so intrigued, and I think it's something I've really called to do. Um, these like isolation and solitude is a breeding ground for creativity and like getting to know yourself, building a relationship with yourself is how I look at it.
The dreams that I had during that retreat were wild. They were so vivid. The walks that I had in the forest outside of the meditation hours were almost psychedelic. I've never walked through a forest and felt the life in the forest more than I did. When, I guess, when you are day in and day out, sharpening the mind and practicing that focused concentration, when you leave and you open your eyes, you're still in there's a hangover from that practice that bleeds into every aspect in your life. And so I would find everything that I did during that week outside of the sitting meditation became a moving meditation or a meditation in itself. Even the way that I was serving myself the food, it was very intentional. And if someone was waiting for the utensil after, I would turn it to their direction and they would give me a little thing, like a little hand on their chest because we weren't making eye contact. Just everything became a meditation. And so really that's another thing to take from this is how to apply that to being conscious and intentional in your life outside of everything, much like you are when you're teaching a new person how to throw a left hook. They have to be intentional in the movements,
Hmm.
they have to think about it. Um, that was a big takeaway for me as well.
And through practice, a hook becomes second nature, just like this mindfulness practice. And something I noticed, and maybe as you started talking about your cadence of speech became slower and more intentional. And I started my immediately, I noticed my thoughts go to like, am I being mindful? And I started feeling like I'm listening and I'm like, oh, I can feel the rings on my fingers. Oh, I can feel my socks. It's really interesting. The amount of information our sensory nervous system is telling us all the time that we just
Yeah,
like disregard. Like, one of my
yeah.
experiences with psychedelics is pain.
Mm.
Like every time I've done a decent amount of a psychedelic dose for whatever ceremony, my ankles, my shins, like I can feel the impact of my job. Like we just smash our bodies
Yeah,
into stuff.
yeah, yeah.
And it made me realize like, oh, I feel this way all the time, and my body's just learned to like black it out
Hmm.
until my perception changes.
Hmm.
Ve-
Interesting, interesting. Yeah, so like you were talking about how my cadence was changing, your breath was changing, your attention was changing. Now I'm going to take you back. Visualize that room. 70 people in there. Day 7. We've been practicing. We're deep in our meditative practice. Everything is a moving meditation. Now we're sitting down for an hour in what's called strong posture meditation, where we are not moving an eyelash the entire time. There's no adjusting in the chair, there's no sitting up, there's no moving the neck. You are sitting for an hour. The energy in that room was addictive. It was so present, and you couldn't not feel it. It was incredible. It was power, is what it was.
Yeah, the power of that, like we don't really register, but we emit, right? Like, we don't feel people's energy.
Hmm.
I can't
Hmm.
even imagine what that would have been like. I think about like rooms where like I have a classical martial arts background, where like doing kata, like sitting
Mm.
before we sit and meditate, like you can feel that, but it's never been 70 people in a room like that,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
7 days into practice. Very cool, very cool. I'm sure we could do a whole podcast on this.
Yeah.
Um, but last couple things, we're getting close to an hour here. Tell us
Hmm.
about your nonprofit, because I wasn't even aware of this. So tell me a little bit more about what it is and how people can find out more and work with you.
Yeah, so the Move for Life Foundation was started by myself and a few other transplant recipients that I met at the World Transplant Games in 2017. So in every 2 years around the world, there are this event called the World Transplant Games, and it's a week-long competition. In fact, it's partnered with the International Olympic Committee, so it's structured with in the same way, opening ceremonies, closing ceremonies, different sports on different days. So I happened to meet some swimmers that were either from Ontario or from Quebec. And we all had a love of swimming. We all had a transplant. We all had movement in our background. And so we met there, and we would just became as like a unit, a family unit, a bunch of real close friends. And then when COVID hit, we were the World Transplant Games for 2021. Um, they were canceled, and so we were thinking, what are we gonna do? We want to do something. So my friend Jillian Best, who's another liver transplant recipient who lives in London, and I were talking a little bit about potentially swimming across Lake Ontario. And that would be because we're swimmers, and that seems like a big thing to take on. And how do we raise awareness around this? And we figured we would set up a not-for-profit. So we went through all the steps to become a registered not-for-profit. And the idea initially was for Jill and I to both swim across the lake, which is a huge undertaking, which is a 52-kilometer swim from
Wow.
Niagara on the Lake to Toronto. So it's a very big undertaking. There are only a handful of people that have done it ever. I had to pull out at the time, which means that Jillian did it herself. I had to pull out because I was actually put back on the transplant list in the in the middle of 2020. But that has since passed, and I'm now on hold. My status is not active on the transplant list, which is great. Um, so she ended up swimming 52 kilometers across Lake Ontario. We raised on that swim, I think, $180,000. With that money, we donated it to London Health Sciences Centre, which is where Jillian had her transplant. And we purchased a first in Canada ever machine that assists in transplantation called an ARP machine. And what an ARP machine does is it extends the life of an organ when it's outside of a donor's body, which means it gives it more time to be able to get to the appropriate person,
Wow.
which means the right person gets it, not the closest person gets it, which ultimately leads to more transplants and a shorter waiting time on the waiting list. And then in 20 the very next year, 2022, so we did this one in 2021, 2022, we did a 1,600-kilometer relay around Ontario, and that relay was representative of the 1,600 people who are in Ontario at any given time who are waiting for an organ transplant. So 1,600 people are on the transplant list right now, as they were back then. It's a rough number. So each kilometer was for somebody that was waiting, and we raised another $100,000, which we then paid towards the operating costs of that ARP machine at the London Health Sciences Centre. Um, and then every year we do also a walk and talk event. We've done two walk and talk events. And the reason we do a walk and talk event is because, like you probably know, but a lot of people don't know, when somebody registers to be an organ donor, um, and they pass away, that person's family can come in and override their organ donation wishes. They can say, "We don't want that." So the idea between the walk and talk is to walk because it's a community and we're all in at Move for Life. We're about active, healthy lifestyles post transplantation, shortening the wait list, but providing a framework for people to see healthy, active lifestyles after, but also to talk about our wishes as organ donors to our family, or talk about the fact that we need to talk to our family about these wishes. And the community outreach for these events is phenomenal. We raised another 25, well, just under $30,000 for this last walk and talk that we did, which was about 3 weeks ago. So
Wow.
it's incredible. We Move for Life. You can find us on Instagram at Move for Life Foundation. We are at moveforlifefoundation.com. And you can either follow me on Instagram as well. I'm sure you can add that later.
I'm gonna put it in
And
the show notes, but say it as well. Your Instagram handle, any way to reach you.
yeah, so it's at chasing underscore greatness. But greatness is spelled Greytness because my name is Gray. So I'm chasing greatness. So it's at chasing underscore greatness. So feel free to look me up and add me. I love to say hi and connect with more people out there. But that, in a nutshell, is what Move for Life is about. It's about providing a framework for transplant recipients to see active, healthy lifestyles, to shorten the wait list, to raise money and change people's lives. We've got some big plans coming up for next year and 2025. I'm really excited about. It's another World Transplant Games year, so a lot of the Move for Life Foundation team will be in Dresden, Germany, in August of next year, competing at the World Transplant Games and hopefully set some more records like we like to do.
That's awesome. Awesome, great, and I think it's an important point to mention. We're an hour into the podcast. None of this would be possible if people didn't register to be organ donors.
Hmm.
If you're listening to this and it's something you want to get educated on, you can message myself or Gray. Um, every 3 days in Ontario, at least, I know that's the statistic. I'm not sure worldwide, but someone dies waiting for an organ, and we have enough organs. We just don't have enough education. A lot of people are
Yeah.
scared and don't understand it.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, this everything, all the lives you affected, all the lives I've affected, has only been able to happen because someone was educated and wanted to save their life from their demise. So, um, if you guys have questions about that, you want to learn how to register to be an organ donor. It varies from province and country and stuff, but I think it's a very, very important cause. And I like to end this podcast always with a quote. And I have a bunch of daily inspiration books where I read a single page, and this was it today. And I thought it was so fitting because we had this podcast planned. But never ever give up when a trial presents itself on the path, and many trials will present themselves along the way. Yes, before your greatest victory, you will certainly face your greatest challenge. With an awareness that this is all part of that this is all part of the route that you must travel to return home to your authentic self. It will be easier for you. You will be prepared.
Hmm.
We
I
live in a
like that.
simulation.
I like that. I do have a rough little quote that I say. I do a lot of public speaking. So anytime I'm in front of people, especially young people, I like to leave them with this. And it's simply that it's not what happens to you that's important, but it's how you respond to what happens to you that makes all the difference.
I couldn't agree more, brother.
Thank you so much for this, Matt. This was thanks for having me as your first guest. It's incredible. It's an honor. It's a privilege. Honestly, thank you from my heart to yours.
Thank you for the time. You're someone that ever since we met has always been someone I seek inspiration from, and someone we're two peas in a pod, so it
Yeah,
makes me
yeah,
feel less alone in the world. And I look forward to collaborating more in the future.
absolutely.
I'm planning to come up your way up out east, hopefully in the next couple months. So I'll keep you posted and we'll connect.
Do that, do that. All right.
Awesome. Cheers.